All right, let's dive in. Ready for a whirlwind tour of, well, pretty much all of history.
Sounds ambitious.
It is. Our listener sent us this single document. It tries to cover everything. I mean, everything. From the very beginning, like the Big Bang beginning, all the way up to the 20th century.
Wow. That's a lot of ground to cover.
It is, but that's what we do here on these deep dives, friends.
Merci.
So where does this document even begin?
Well, it starts in a pretty unexpected place, actually. With humans, get this, as atoms. 3 billion years ago.
Humans as atoms. That's a new way to think about it.
Right. It really puts things in perspective, the vastness of time, the whole cosmic timeline. We're just a tiny little blip in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, a little humbling. But we eventually, become more than atoms. The document goes through, millions of years to hominins around 6 million years ago. But then instead of hanging out in caves for too long, it jumps way ahead.
To 4000 BCE, right? To the city of Eridu in Sumeria.
Eridu, Sumeria. Why there? What's so special about that?
Well, that's where things start to get really interesting. That's when agriculture emerges.
Agriculture. So we're talking about this shift from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled farmers, right?
Exactly. And it wasn't just about, planting crops and staying in one place. This shift had a huge impact on human societies and even on our biology.
Our biology? Wait, you're telling me farming changed, how we actually looked?
It did. According to the document, the average height for men actually decreased, went from around 5'9" down to 5'3".
Wow. That's a pretty big difference.
It is, probably due to a combination of things. Harder work in the fields, maybe a less diverse diet than they had as hunter-gatherers.
Makes you wonder if any of those early farmers ever got nostalgic for the hunting and gathering days. But I guess besides height, agriculture really set the stage for, well, everything that came next, right?
Absolutely. Cities, complex social structures, even the need for laws and systems of governance.
Laws and governance. Speaking of which, the document mentions something about Hammurabi's Code in 1772 BCE.
Yes. Hammurabi's Code. One of the earliest known sets of written laws. Fascinating stuff.
I know the name, but to be honest, all I remember is an eye for an eye. What else was in there?
Oh, it covered a lot more than just revenge. It dealt with trade, property, family matters, even medical practices. It really gives us a glimpse into what Babylonian society was like.
So it wasn't just about punishment. It was about establishing order, setting some ground rules.
Exactly. Though it's worth noting that the punishments often depended on your social status. A wealthy landowner would get off much easier than a commoner for the same crime.
So not exactly a model of equality then.
Not quite. But still, an incredible achievement for its time. To have laws written down, codified, it's a major step in the development of civilization.
Makes sense. But while the Babylonians were figuring out law and order, what was going on in other parts of the world?
Well, around the same time, you had the Indus Valley civilization flourishing.
The Indus Valley people. Okay, what were they up to? Building pyramids? Fighting wars?
Not exactly. You see, while other civilizations were focused on grand monuments and tombs, the Indus Valley people were prioritizing something quite different. Sanitation.
Sanitation, you mean?
They had surprisingly sophisticated sewage and drainage systems in their cities, really advanced urban planning for the time.
Wow, so instead of pyramid, they built toilets. That's pretty impressive.
It is. It shows that different civilizations can have very different priorities. But speaking of grand monuments...
We got to talk about the Egyptians, right? The pyramids, the pharaohs, the whole quest for immortality.
The document doesn't shy away from that. Describes the pharaohs obsessed with their afterlife, the complex social hierarchy, everyone serving the pharaoh and his journey to the afterlife.
And those pyramids, I mean, what a feat of engineering.
Yeah.
To build those massive structures with the technology they had.
The Great Pyramid of Giza, just to give you an idea, took over 20 years to build, tens of thousands of workers.
It's mind-boggling. But let's not forget, while all this was happening in Egypt, other civilizations were developing elsewhere. The document mentions China, and a story about a guy called Yu the Great.
Yu the Great, he's a legendary figure. The story goes that he tamed the Yellow River, saving China from devastating floods.
So he was like a superhero flood engineer.
Kind of. Although the story's probably more myth than history. But it highlights the importance of water management in early Chinese civilization.
Makes sense. You can't build a civilization if you're constantly being washed away by floods.
Right. And the story of Yu the Great also introduces this key concept in Chinese political thought, the mandate of heaven.
The mandate of heaven. What's that all about?
It's the idea that a ruler's right to rule comes from heaven. If they're just and benevolent, the heavens will grant them prosperity. But if they become corrupt or incompetent,
The heavens say, nope, you're out.
exactly. Natural disasters, social unrest, those were seen as signs that the ruler had lost the mandate of heaven and it was time for a new dynasty to take over.
Wow, it's like a built-in system of checks and balances. But while China was developing its unique political philosophy, other parts of the world were seeing the rise of powerful empires.
That's right. Over in Anatolia, you had the Hittite Empire emerging under King Labarnus I. And in Greece, the Mycenaean civilization was taking shape.
The Hittites, the Mycenaeans. It's amazing how these civilizations were developing simultaneously.
It is. And each one contributed to this incredible story of human history.
So many threads weaving together. But let's jump back to Egypt for a minute. The document mentions a big clash between Ramses II and the Hittites at a place called Kadesh.
Ah, yes. The Battle of Kadesh, fought in 1279 BCE. It's famous not just for the battle itself, but also for what happened afterwards.
Okay, so what went down at Kadesh?
Well, Ramses was kind of known for his, boasting. He had a bigger army than the Hittites, but he got tricked. They lured him into a trap, and he almost lost everything.
So not exactly a glorious victory for Ramses then.
Nope. Ended in a stalemate. But here's the really interesting part. After this near disaster, Ramses and the Hittite king actually signed a peace treaty.
A peace treaty?
The earliest known peace treaty in history. It shows that even after a fierce battle, these two empires chose diplomacy.
That's pretty incredible. Gives you a little hope for humanity, right?
It does. But while peace was being forged in the Middle East, let's hop across the globe. The document mentions the Olmec civilization in Mesoamerica.
The Olmecs? I've heard of them, but mostly because of those giant stone heads they left behind.
Those heads are amazing. They're colossal, intricately carved, and we still don't know exactly how they transported them or even what their purpose was.
It's like they just appeared out of nowhere, a real enigma.
They are. But even though we don't know everything about them, it's clear the Olmecs had a huge influence on later Mesoamerican cultures, like the Maya and the Aztecs.
So while Ramses was making peace with the Hittites, the Olmecs were busy shaping the cultural landscape of Mesoamerica.
It really is remarkable how these events were happening all over the world, parallel to each other.
A true tapestry of history. And speaking of tapestries, what about China? We left them with the whole mandate of heaven thing.
Well, while the Olmecs were doing their thing, the Zhou dynasty was rising to prominence in China.
The Zhou dynasty. Now that's a big one, right? I remember learning about their system of feudalism, but it's a bit fuzzy. Can you refresh my memory?
Sure. Basically, feudalism in China was a system of decentralized power. The king would grant land to nobles in exchange for loyalty and military service.
So it's like, here's some land, but you owe me.
Exactly. And those nobles would then grant land to lesser lords and so on, creating this whole hierarchy of power.
Makes sense. But beyond the political stuff, the Zhou dynasty is also known for something else, right?
You're thinking of the philosophical schools that emerged during this period.
Like Confucianism and Taoism.
Exactly. Confucianism, with its emphasis on social harmony and ethical conduct, would become a cornerstone of Chinese culture.
And Taoism, with its focus on nature and living in harmony with the Tao, offered a very different, more mystical perspective.
It's fascinating how these two contrasting philosophies coexisted and shaped Chinese thought for centuries.
Really shows the diversity of human thought, even within one civilization. But while China was delving into philosophy, a new power was emerging in the Mediterranean. One that we can't ignore because it would, well, kind of take over the world.
You're talking about the Greeks.
The Greeks, masters of drama, philosophy, democracy, and let's not forget, colonization.
Right. The text mentions the Greeks establishing colonies all over the Mediterranean. They had this need to expand, find new resources, new lands to settle.
And one of those colonies would become, well, let's just say pretty important.
You mean Rome, of course.
Rome.
Yeah.
And the document tells the story, doesn't it?
The legend of Romulus and Remus, twin brothers raised by a she-wolf.
Okay, I know this one. They argue over where to build a city and
Romulus kills Remus.
Talk about sibling rivalry. But a rather dramatic start for the city that would become the center of a vast empire.
It is. But while Rome's story was just beginning, another empire was rising to power in the east. The Persian Empire, under Cyrus the Great.
Cyrus the Great, another legendary figure. I vaguely remember something about a prophecy and a hidden childhood.
That's right. The story goes that Cyrus was destined for greatness. He overthrew his grandfather, conquered Babylon, and established a vast empire based on tolerance and respect for different cultures.
So a bit of a different approach than Romulus.
Definitely. But these two rising powers, Rome and Persia, their paths wouldn't directly collide.
Oh, so no epic Roman-Persian showdown.
Not quite, but Persia would become the main rival of, you guessed it, the Greeks.
The Greco-Persian Wars. This is where we get those legendary battles like Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis.
Exactly. The Greco-Persian Wars were a defining moment in Greek history. They showed the world that even a small, outnumbered force could defeat a mighty empire.
David and Goliath, ancient Greek style. And of course, we can't forget about the marathon itself.
26.2 miles, all because of that messenger who ran from Marathon to Athens to announce the victory.
And then dropped dead. Talk about dedication.
No kidding! But while all this fighting was going on, the Greeks were also experimenting with something back home in Athens, something quite radical for the time: democracy.
Athenian democracy, a truly revolutionary idea. Citizens having a say in their government, participating in the assembly, serving on the Council of 500.
It was a bold experiment, but not without its flaws. Women, slaves, foreigners, they were all excluded. And even some of the Greeks themselves had their doubts about democracy.
Like Plato, right. He wasn't exactly a fan of the whole rule by the people thing.
Not quite. In his book, The Republic, Plato argued for a society ruled by philosopher kings. Wise, virtuous individuals who would guide society towards the highest good.
A philosopher king. Sounds pretty ideal. But in reality, who gets to decide who's wise and virtuous enough to rule? It's a tricky question. But while the Greeks were debating democracy and philosopher kings, someone else was on a very different kind of journey.
You're talking about Siddhartha Gautama, right?
The Buddha, the story of the prince who gave up everything to seek enlightenment.
It's a story that's resonated with people for centuries. The Buddha's teachings on suffering, compassion, and the path to liberation offered a different way of understanding the human condition.
A path that wasn't about conquering empires or accumulating wealth, but about inner peace and spiritual awakening. Quite a contrast to another figure of the time, Alexander the Great.
Ah, yes, Alexander, the conqueror, the military genius. The text describes his incredible rise to power, his conquest of the Persian Empire, and his death at just 32 years old.
Talk about a life cut short. But he managed to pack a lot into those 32 years.
He did. And his conquests had a lasting impact. They spread Greek culture and ideas across a vast territory, creating a fusion of East and West that would influence art, philosophy, and even language for centuries to come.
It's amazing how these individual lives can shape the course of history. But while Alexander was conquering the world, another empire was experiencing a very different kind of transformation, far to the east.
The Mauryan Empire in India.
That's the one, specifically under the reign of Emperor Ashoka.
Ashoka. Now, he's an interesting character. Starts out as a pretty ruthless conqueror himself, but then
Then he has a change of heart, right?
Exactly. After witnessing the horrors of war, he converts to Buddhism and dedicates himself to promoting peace and nonviolence.
So from warmonger to peacemaker. Quite a transformation.
It is. He renounced violence, encouraged religious tolerance, and focused on building a just and compassionate society.
A real model for leaders throughout history. But while Ashoka was promoting peace in India, let's not forget about our friends in the West.
The Romans.
Right. Remember that little colony they founded? Well, things are about to get interesting. The Roman Republic is on the rise, and the document dives into their epic struggle against Carthage. The Punic Wars.
The Punic Wars. 3 major conflicts that spanned over a century.
And we can't talk about the Punic Wars without mentioning Hannibal, right?
What?
The Carthaginian general who marched his army, complete with elephants, over the Alps.
Talk about a logistical nightmare.
No kidding. But Hannibal's invasion of Italy shook Rome to its core.
He won some incredible victories, but ultimately, Rome's resilience and resources proved too much for Carthage to overcome.
And those victories paved the way for Rome to become the dominant power in the Mediterranean.
Exactly. But while Rome was conquering the West, China was going through its own cycles of unification and division. The document focuses on 2 contrasting figures: Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, and the Han dynasty that followed him.
Qin Shi Huang, I remember. Wasn't he a bit of a tyrant?
Well, he was known for his ruthlessness, that's for sure. He unified China through force, implemented a strict system of legalism, and was obsessed with immortality.
Legalism? That doesn't sound very fun.
It wasn't. Think strict laws, harsh punishments, absolute obedience to the state.
So Basically, do as you're told or else.
Pretty much. But despite his brutality, Qin Shi Huang did bring about stability and unification after centuries of warfare. His dynasty, however, was short-lived. The Han dynasty that followed adopted a very different approach.
More peace and love than law and order.
You could say that. The Han emperors embraced Confucianism, fostered a golden age of culture and prosperity, and even established trade links with the Roman Empire through the Silk Road.
Wow. So we've got empires rising and falling, philosophies clashing, trade routes connecting east and west.
Yeah.
It's almost too much to keep track of.
It is. But that's what makes history so fascinating.
Absolutely. So many stories, so many connections, and we've only just scratched the surface.
It really is. Like we're piecing together this giant puzzle, with all these different pieces from different parts of the world.
And just when you think you've got a handle on things, a new piece pops up and changes everything.
Exactly. And as we move into the late Roman Empire, we see how interconnected everything really is. The document highlights the reign of Diocletian.
Diocletian.
Yeah.
Wasn't he the guy who tried to fix the Roman Empire by splitting it in half? Or was it four?
4. He created the Tetrarchy. He divided the empire into 4 administrative regions, each with its own co-emperor.
So basically, too much for one guy to handle.
Basically, the empire had become too vast, too complex to manage. Diocletian thought sharing the power would make things more stable.
Smart idea, right? Did it work?
Well, not really. It helped for a while, but it didn't solve the underlying problems. The empire was facing internal struggles, economic instability, pressure from migrating peoples.
A recipe for disaster.
Pretty much. And out of all this chaos emerged a figure who would change the course of Roman history. Constantine.
Constantine the Great, the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. The document talks about his vision at the Milvian Bridge, his victory over his rival Maxentius.
A pivotal moment. Before Constantine, Christianity was a persecuted sect, but he saw it as a unifying force for the empire.
And he went all in, didn't he? Issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians, convened the Council of Nicaea to establish key Christian doctrines.
He basically made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, a huge shift.
From outlawed to endorsed. Talk about a turnaround.
And Constantine's decision had a ripple effect throughout history, shaping the religious landscape of Europe for centuries to come.
It's incredible how one person's choices can have such a massive impact. But while Christianity was on the rise within the Roman Empire, a new threat was emerging from the east. The Huns.
The Huns, nomadic warriors known for their equestrian skills and their ferocity in battle. Their arrival in Europe sent shockwaves through the Roman world.
I remember learning about Attila the Hun in school. Wasn't he nicknamed the Scourge of God?
He was, and for good reason. Attila led the Huns on a series of devastating campaigns, sacking cities, extorting tribute, spreading terror wherever he went.
Sounds like a guy you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. But didn't he meet his match eventually? I vaguely recall something about a showdown with the Pope.
That's right. In 452 CE, Attila marched on Rome itself. But instead of facing a military confrontation, he met with Pope Leo I.
And what happened?
Well, the details are a bit murky, but the story goes that Pope Leo, through diplomacy and perhaps a bit of divine intervention, convinced Attila to spare the city.
So talk your way out of a sacking. Impressive. But even though Rome was spared, the Western Roman Empire was already in pretty bad shape, right?
It was. Years of internal strife, economic woes, constant pressure from invaders.
It's only a matter of time.
Exactly. And that time came in 476 CE when a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor.
The fall of Rome. End of an era.
It was a momentous event that marked the beginning of the Middle Ages. But while the lights were going out in the West, another empire was shining brightly in the East. The Gupta Empire in India.
The Gupta Empire. Now, they were known for their intellectual and cultural achievements, right?
Exactly. They made incredible advancements in mathematics, astronomy, literature, art. It was a true golden age.
I remember learning about their contributions to math, specifically. Weren't they the ones who figured out the concept of zero as a placeholder in calculations?
That's right. And they also made remarkably accurate calculations of the Earth's circumference.
Pretty impressive for their time.
It is. But while the Gupta Empire was thriving in India, Europe was going through its own transformations. New kingdoms were emerging, Christianity was spreading, and a new social and political order was taking shape. Feudalism.
Feudalism, yeah, I remember that from history class. Knights, castles, the whole medieval scene.
It's a bit more complicated than that, of course. But essentially, feudalism was a system that arose in response to the chaos and instability of the early Middle Ages.
So no more Roman Empire to keep things in check.
Exactly. Central authority had collapsed, and local lords gained power. Feudalism was a way to organize society and provide defense in this fragmented and dangerous world.
So how did it work? I mean, beyond the knights and castles.
Well, it was based on a hierarchy of reciprocal obligations. The king would grant land to nobles, called vassals, in exchange for their loyalty and military service.
So it's like, I'll protect you, but you owe me.
Exactly. And those vassals would then grant land to lesser lords, creating this whole pyramid of power and obligation. At the bottom of this pyramid were the peasants who worked the land and supported the whole system.
So not exactly a system of equality.
Not quite, but it did provide a degree of order and stability in a very turbulent time. And within this system, you had the knights, mounted warriors who were bound by codes of chivalry and honor.
The knights in shining armor. Always a popular image of the Middle Ages.
It is, though reality was often much less glamorous. But the knights did play a crucial role in medieval warfare, and their code of chivalry, even if not always followed, did influence social norms and ideals.
So it wasn't all just about fighting and conquering.
No. There were other aspects to medieval life, of course. Religion played a huge role, for example. And this brings us to another significant event of the time. The Crusades.
The Crusades, those holy wars launched by European Christians to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control.
Exactly. The Crusades were a complex and multifaceted phenomenon, driven by religious zeal, political ambition, economic motivations, all intertwined.
And they had a huge impact on both Europe and the Middle East, didn't they?
Absolutely. The text focuses on Pope Urban II's call for a crusade in 1095. He urged Christians to liberate Jerusalem, promising spiritual rewards and forgiveness of sins.
Talk about a powerful motivator.
It was, and the First Crusade was a military success for the Europeans. They captured Jerusalem in 1099, establishing Crusader states in the Holy Land.
But holding on to those territories proved to be much more challenging, right?
It was. The Crusades were a back-and-forth affair, with control of Jerusalem shifting between Christian and Muslim forces.
The document tells the story of Saladin, the Muslim leader who recaptured Jerusalem in 1187.
Saladin's victory was a major turning point, leading to the Third Crusade, led by European monarchs like Richard the Lionheart of England. But even with all their might, the Crusaders failed to retake Jerusalem.
So the Crusades ultimately failed to achieve their main objective.
They did, but they left a lasting legacy, shaping relations between the Christian and Islamic worlds for centuries to come.
A legacy of both conflict and cultural exchange.
Exactly. And while the Crusaders were battling it out in the Middle East, another force was on the rise. A force that would reshape the map of Eurasia and leave an indelible mark on history. The Mongols.
The Mongols, led by the legendary Genghis Khan, right?
The one and only. Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes, creating a formidable fighting force known for its horsemanship, archery, and brilliant military tactics.
The document describes the Mongol conquests in pretty terrifying detail. They weren't exactly known for their mercy.
No, they weren't. But despite their reputation for brutality, the Mongols were actually pretty tolerant of different religions and cultures, and their vast empire, ironically, facilitated trade and cultural exchange between East and West.
So out of destruction came connection.
In a way, yes. It's a reminder that history is full of paradoxes. But while the Mongols were reshaping Asia, Europe was undergoing its own set of transformations.
The document mentions a few key developments in this period. The signing of the Magna Carta in England, the devastating impact of the Black Death, and the rise of powerful empires in Africa, like the Mali Empire under Mansa Musa.
The Magna Carta, signed in 1215, was a landmark document that limited the power of the English king and guaranteed certain rights to the nobility.
So a step towards democracy, even in the midst of feudalism.
You could say that. It set a precedent for limiting royal power and laying the groundwork for constitutional government.
Pretty significant. But while England was taking baby steps towards democracy, Europe was hit by a catastrophe of epic proportions, the Black Death.
The Black Death, a bubonic plague pandemic that swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history.
I remember learning about it. Millions dead, cities deserted, mass graves.
That is a truly horrific time. The Black Death had a devastating impact on Europe, both in terms of population loss and the social and economic upheaval that followed. It really shook people's faith in everything.
Makes sense. Death on that scale, it's hard to even imagine. But while Europe was dealing with plague and chaos, a different story was unfolding in West Africa. The Mali Empire, under Mansa Musa, was experiencing a golden age.
Mansa Musa is legendary for his wealth, his piety, and his famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. His journey, documented by Arab scholars, showcased the wealth and splendor of the Mali Empire to the world.
Wasn't he the guy who gave away so much gold during his pilgrimage that he actually caused inflation?
That's the one. It shows just how wealthy the Mali Empire was. And Mansa Musa wasn't just about wealth. He was a patron of scholarship and the arts, and his reign saw a flourishing of Islamic culture in West Africa.
So while Europe was in the depths of despair, the Mali Empire was thriving. It's amazing how different parts of the world can be experiencing such contrasting realities at the same time.
It is. And as we move into the late Middle Ages, we see a series of events that will set the stage for the early modern world. The fall of Constantinople, the rise of the Renaissance in Europe, and those daring voyages of exploration that would connect the continents in unprecedented ways.
The fall of Constantinople, that was a big one, right?
Huge. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks, led by Sultan Mehmed II, conquered Constantinople, bringing an end to the Byzantine Empire.
The end of an empire that had stood for over 1,000 years.
It was a major shift in power. And while Constantinople was falling in the east, a new spirit of cultural and intellectual awakening was emerging in the west. The Renaissance.
The Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Shakespeare.
All those big names. The Renaissance was a period of rediscovery, innovation, a revival of classical learning and art.
A time of great change and creativity. And this spirit of exploration wasn't just limited to art and ideas. It extended to the physical world as well, with those intrepid explorers setting sail across the oceans.
The age of exploration, driven by a thirst for knowledge, wealth, and new trade routes. Think Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Ferdinand Magellan.
Sailing off into the unknown, facing storms, sea monsters.
Well, maybe not sea monsters, but definitely facing incredible challenges and risks.
And their voyages changed the world forever, didn't they? Connecting continents, facilitating trade, but also leading to colonization and the exploitation of indigenous peoples.
It's a complex legacy, for sure, one that we're still grappling with today. But as we move into the 16th century, things get even more complex.
Religious upheavals, imperial conquests, the rise of new powers.
And the seeds of the modern world are being sown.
Buckle up, it's going to be a wild ride.
So we're in the 16th century now, and Europe's going through some major growing pains.
Yeah, it feels like things are really starting to shift, like the old world's being shaken up and something new is trying to emerge.
Exactly. And the document highlights this pivotal moment, the Protestant Reformation. It all starts with this guy, Martin Luther, a German monk who had some serious issues with the Catholic Church.
Martin Luther, yeah. I remember learning about him. Wasn't he the one who nailed those 95 theses to the church door?
The one and only. He was basically calling out the church for corruption, for abusing its power, especially the whole selling of indulgences thing, paying your way out of sin. Luther wasn't having it.
Yeah, that doesn't sound very spiritual.
Not really. Luther believed that salvation came through faith alone, not through rituals or good works or, paying the church a bunch of money.
So it was a challenge to the church's authority on a fundamental level.
Exactly. And Luther's ideas spread like wildfire thanks to the printing press. People started questioning the church's teachings, demanding reforms.
And this led to a whole new branch of Christianity, right?
Yeah.
Protestantism.
It did.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just one branch. You had Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anglicanism, all these different Protestant denominations popping up.
So the religious landscape of Europe was completely transformed. But while all this was happening, Spain was busy building an empire across the ocean, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. The conquistadors were conquering vast territories in the Americas, driven by a thirst for gold, glory, and, converting the natives to Christianity.
The document doesn't sugarcoat it. It talks about Hernán Cortés and his conquest of the Aztecs, Francisco Pizarro, and the Incas. Brutal stuff.
It was. The Spanish had superior weapons, horses, and unfortunately, diseases that the native populations had no immunity to. It was a clash of cultures, and the indigenous people paid a heavy price.
A reminder that history is full of these dark chapters. But while the Spanish were building their empire in the Americas, another empire was reaching its peak in the East, the Ottoman Empire, under Suleiman the Magnificent.
Suleiman the Magnificent. He was a remarkable ruler, expanded the empire, reformed the legal system, patronized the arts and sciences.
The Ottoman Empire, under him, was this vast, powerful force, stretching across 3 continents. It must have felt like the whole world was at their feet.
It did. But while Suleiman was ruling the East, over in England, you had another monarch making waves, Henry VIII.
Ah, Henry VIII. The one with all the wives.
The one and only. And his desire for a male heir and his, let's say, complicated love life would have huge consequences for England.
Because he wanted to divorce his wife and the church said nope.
Exactly. So Henry did what any self-respecting king would do. He broke with the Catholic Church and declared himself the head of the Church of England.
Talk about a power move.
It was, and it led to a whole religious upheaval in England, the English Reformation, they call it.
So we've got religious turmoil in Europe, empires rising and falling, and over in Russia, you've got Ivan the Terrible making a name for himself.
Ivan the Terrible. Now, there's a guy who lived up to his nickname.
I remember learning about him, known for his brutality, his paranoia, his tendency to get rid of anyone who disagreed with him.
He wasn't exactly known for his warm and fuzzy personality, but he did consolidate power in Russia, expanded the empire's borders, and laid the groundwork for a powerful centralized state.
So a bit of a mixed legacy.
Definitely, a complex figure. But while Russia was going through its own turbulent times, over in England, things were a bit more, shall we say, cultured.
Ah, you mean the Elizabethan era? Queen Elizabeth III, Shakespeare, all that good stuff.
Exactly. It was a golden age for English literature, theater, and exploration.
Shakespeare's plays, they're still performed today, centuries later. Talk about a lasting impact.
It's incredible. His ability to capture the human condition, to tell stories that resonate across time and cultures, it's truly remarkable. But while England was enjoying its cultural renaissance, let's not forget about what was happening across the Atlantic.
The colonization of North America. The document mentions the establishment of Jamestown and Quebec, those early settlements that would eventually become
The United States and Canada.
Exactly. It's the beginning of a whole new chapter in history, with all its complexities and contradictions.
A story of exploration, opportunity, but also conflict, displacement, and the clash of cultures.
A story that's still being written today in many ways.
It is. But while Europeans were settling in North America, back in Europe, they were also busy fighting each other.
You're talking about the 30 Years' War, right? A religious war that engulfed much of Europe in the 17th century.
It was a devastating conflict. Catholics versus Protestants, different kingdoms vying for power. It dragged on for decades and left Europe exhausted and scarred.
But out of this chaos and destruction, something new emerged, didn't it?
The Enlightenment, a period of intellectual ferment where reason and individual liberty were championed. Thinkers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant.
Big thinkers, challenging old ways of thinking, advocating for human rights, questioning authority.
And their ideas would have a profound impact on the world. They inspired revolutions, shaped political systems, and continue to influence us today.
And those ideas, they found fertile ground in the American colonies, didn't they? Leading to the American Revolution.
Exactly. The colonists, inspired by Enlightenment ideals of self-government and individual liberty, rose up against British rule, declaring their independence and establishing a new nation based on democratic principles.
A bold move. And it inspired others to fight for their own freedoms.
Absolutely. The American Revolution was a beacon of hope, a model for revolutions around the world. And it also helped to spark another revolution closer to home.
The French Revolution.
The French Revolution, fueled by economic inequality, social unrest, and of course, those Enlightenment ideals.
The storming of the Bastille, the Reign of Terror. It was a tumultuous time.
It was. And out of this chaos emerged a figure who would dominate European politics for over a decade. Napoleon Bonaparte.
Napoleon, the brilliant military strategist, the ambitious conqueror, and ultimately the emperor who overreached and fell from grace.
His story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most powerful individuals can be brought down by their own ambition.
But Napoleon's conquests, they had a lasting impact, didn't they? They spread revolutionary ideas, shook up the old order, and set the stage for a new era.
They did, and as Europe was recovering from the Napoleonic Wars, a new set of challenges and ideas was emerging.
The Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
Mass production, factories, urbanization. It completely changed the way people lived and worked.
And it also created new problems like poverty, inequality, and environmental damage.
The document mentions Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who responded to these problems by developing a new ideology, Marxism.
Marxism, with its critique of capitalism and its vision of a classless society, would have a huge impact on 20th century history. It inspired revolutions, social movements, and debates about economic justice that continue to this day.
And while all this was happening, European powers were engaged in another kind of competition, the scramble for Africa.
Right. Driven by economic greed and a sense of superiority, European nations carved up Africa among themselves, exploiting its resources and people.
A dark chapter in history. The legacy of colonialism, with its lasting impacts on Africa and the world.
It is. And these global rivalries, fueled by nationalism and competition for power, would eventually lead to the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen, World War I.
World War I. Triggered by the assassination of an archduke, but fueled by decades of tension and a tangled web of alliances.
It was a war that nobody really won. Millions dead, empires collapsed, and the world was left reeling.
And tragically, it set the stage for an even deadlier conflict just a few decades later, World War II.
World War II. The rise of Nazi Germany, the horrors of the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, it's almost too much to comprehend.
It's a reminder of the depths of human cruelty, but also of the courage and resilience of those who fought for freedom and justice.
And out of the ashes of World War II, a new world order emerged, one dominated by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union.
The Cold War, a period of tension, mistrust, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. It must have felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop.
It did. But despite the fear and uncertainty, there were also incredible advancements in science, technology, and even, in some ways, human rights.
So we end this whirlwind tour of history on a note of, well, it's hard to say, hope, anxiety.
A bit of both, perhaps. We've seen the best and worst of humanity, the incredible things we're capable of, both good and bad.
It's a lot to process, but I think the main takeaway is this. History is not just a collection of facts and dates. It's the story of us, of who we are, where we've been, and where we might be going.
And that's a story that's still being written. We're all part of it. So thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. We hope it sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep exploring.